let's get started. My name is Benny de Jager, or as the PowerPoint captions like to refer to me, Blanky Yogurt. Benny de Jager, I come from Belgium. Belgium is this teeny tiny little country across the other side of the channel, and we are currently the proud holders of the Guinness World Book of Records for being the longest period of time without a government, 541 days. I've made it so far without pissing people off with Brexit jokes, but I'll leave the decision up to you if it's better to have no government or a Boris government. I'll leave it up to you. I'm not here to offend people. I'll just do that. So myself, I'm employed at Microsoft in the Power BI CAT team, which is a fancy word for customer advisory team. We help customers, we help people deal with complex problems, deal with new issues coming out and new things coming into the product. Fairly new into the role, which means that the fire hose of information is open, and I am trying to keep up with everything new popping into these things. I also engage in this little tiny user group called Data Minds. We organize conferences, we organize events, pretty much like we're doing here. It's all about getting people together and learning new things. If you want to reach out to me after the conference, feel free to do so. My social handles are in here. The GitHub handle is also there. Slides are already up there. I think if it's not, just ping me, and then we can get going with that. And small disclaimer, I am not a very big fan of pie charts. I'll just leave that out there. But that is not the topic today. The topic today is data flows. And whenever I talk to people and the word data flows comes up, it is usually a source of confusion. Because data flows is a term that is used all over the place. Google Cloud has data flows. TensorFlow has data flows. When we were working with integration services, we talked about data flows. We had Microsoft Flow that turned into Power Automate. We had Azure Data Factory, which has mapping data flows, which has wrangling data flows, and I think wrangling data flows is now renamed into something else. We've got Power Apps data flows, which became Power Platform data flows. But it is all about Power BI data flows to make sure that we get this clear for everyone. Power BI data flows. And I want to talk to you about this with a few basic questions, give you answers on these basic questions. And the first one is, who do I think should use data flows? And for me, personally, I see this fit for those power users, those people that have a way with data, but aren't necessarily those IT users. Those people that do something with data, but aren't necessarily trained for it. They just want to get results. Business analysts, for instance, data analysts, whatever you want to call it, people who need to get those insights out of data, but don't necessarily have the IT resources to do the jobs for them. Tech-savvy users, and then, well, pretty much everyone else. I think if you're capable of handling a computer and knowing how to turn it off and on again, you may benefit from this as well. But what is this thing? What is Power BI data flows? And to answer that, I have to cover something first for you. And it's this thing we like to refer to as one entity and many data sets. An entity, a table, or a table in this instance, and then across many different data sets, many different little Power BI files or models, if you'd like to refer to them. The most commonly used example is a date dimension. It can be a person dimension or a product table, something that is very commonly used in your organization. And then we start to use that specific table within many different Power BI files. And like I said, the date table is the most common example, because we use a date table in every single Power BI file. And then many people, myself included, we just go online, we find a DAX script from the Italians, or we find a Power Query script by Reza, we paste that in, and we use that. Everything is good in the world. Until tomorrow, the CFO decides that the fiscal year is no longer going to close on July 1st, but we're going to start the new fiscal year on April 1st. What do? That means, in most of these examples, that we have to go look at every single one of those Power BI files and start changing up the fiscal year. Unless there is some form of higher upstream magic thing that does that everything for us. And many organizations like to refer to this as an enterprise data warehouse or a data lake, whatever the fancy buzzword is this year. But we need to have something that handles those common dimensions for us. And in this specific case, I'm talking about a data flow, where we're using the data flow to be put in front of a data set to act as a reusable entity to be reused across many data sets. And I gave the example of a date table, but it can just be that product table as well. What if we decide tomorrow that we're going to implement a new structure to handle with our products? A new master data system, for instance. That is why we look at these things for reusable data entities. And the thing is that if we're not using these things, most of the time, we're going to end up with many different versions. That's it. People start using their own things, people start building their own stuff, and then we get information chaos. That's it. Do I mean that everything needs to be structured and controlled up until the bits and the bytes level? No, we need some form of freedom as well. But for those common things that are crucial to the corporate details and the processes we need, we may want to look at having this a bit more tightly governed. And as of right now, the state of Power BI as it is, reuse of queries is fairly limited. Shared data sets, using a live connection to another data set, is an all or nothing approach. You take the entire data set or you do not take the entire data set. There is this new feature called Direct Query over Power BI Datasets and Azure Analysis Services, or as some people just like to refer to it, Composite Model V2, which allows us to connect to a dataset and only take a few things. But this is still a preview feature, and I'll be honest, performance is an issue if we're looking at larger datasets, if we're looking at multiple entities. So that means that if we want to reuse other datasets, if we want to reuse logic, simply by using the methods inside of Power BI, we're going to run to limitations. So these data flows, I think, can be a good solution for this, until we have multiple options. So Power BI Dataflows was introduced in late 2018. I keep forgetting if it's December or November, but it's late 2018. And it went into general availability in April 2019. That means that it's coming close up until its third birthday, which is not that old for a product, for a part of a product. Power BI itself is only 6 years old in the way that we know it right now. What I've seen in the preview versions in 2018, with the evolutions up until now, it's come a very long way. But we still have a very long way to go. I'll be very open about that. Power BI Dataflows is not an ideal tool for every scenario. And essentially, it is a cloud-based Power Query experience. Power Query online, if you'd like to call it that way. And it is self-service data preparations. It's for those business users trying to make their own data fit, mash, mold, mash up into something new for them to use themselves. And it's mostly aimed at those non-technical business users. Does that mean that the hardcore data lake developer cannot use Power BI Dataflows? No, they can, but they will soon run into the things that it's basically a user interface, and they will want to go back to their PySpark or whatever language they're coding things with. Those IT pros, they typically want to go back to their code or generate the code, whatever they want to do these days. And the entire purpose of a data flow is to build a reusable entity. Reusable. That's the key word of everything I'm telling. Reusable, so that you have a modular approach to make sure if something changes, you can do it easily and quickly. And in my personal opinion, it is not a full-fledged replacement for a data warehouse solution or a data lake or a data lakehouse or a delta lake or whatever term. There are still places where this is very, very useful to have that in those larger enterprises or for those larger data projects. That still makes sense. But does that mean that if we have a new project coming in and we need to prototype something, that we cannot use data flows? Exactly, we can, because it is really useful for that. To quickly create something or have someone with not that many technical skills create something for this. And it is, in many ways, manageable and securable like most Power BI artifacts. It handles exactly the same way. You can use it from inside of your workspaces. And it is, under the covers, something called a managed CDM folder, which is another fancy acronym we like to use. And CDM is a common data model. What that is, I will get back to. So I'd like to show you Dataflows as it is as well. What is this thing that I keep blabbering about? So I need to go to one of the browsers. Yep, there we go. Okay. So essentially, I am inside of Power BI. This is a public tenant where I'm using a premium per user license. That is something that I'm saying right now as well. And if we look at these data flows, I've prepared one. I can go ahead and go into the editing experience if the Wi-Fi wants to work with me. So when I'm in these data flows, I can see all the different tables I have, all the different entities I have. And this is not that similar to what we've seen inside of Power Query, but it is getting there closely. Let's say that I want to go ahead and edit what I've made already so far. And this is where it gets really, really similar to what you can see inside of Power BI Desktop. It's essentially, like I said, Power Query in your browser. And this is where the similarities really exist. The thing is, there are differences. This is cloud-based, whereas Power BI Desktop only gets an update once a month. So that probably means that there is some form of discrepancy, some form of differences in between what you can do in the desktop version or in the online version. There are differences. But 99% of the things you can do easily in these two versions. Let's say that I want to go and create some more things. If I want to go make some actual changes, it is exactly what I can do inside of Power BI. If I want to go ahead and start changing my values, or if I want to go ahead and change types, it is that Power Query experience that we've all known and come to love. The thing is, what I really, really like about Power BI Dataflows in the browsers is that it gives you more than Power BI Desktop. And this is where it gets interesting. How many of you are familiar with the concept of query folding? Okay, good. How many of you can instinctively tell if query folding is taking place? We're dropping the numbers. So there is this thing, and it's essentially a visual indicator. And that visual indicator is telling us if we are still folding that query back to the source. And query folding is the process where we take the transformations we're doing inside of Power Query Online, or in Power Query, and we shift that back to the data source, back to the database, or back to some form of data source that supports this. And it is a recommended approach, because you shift that work back to the machine that is more capable of handling it. And this indicator is going to give you either the green, orange, or red indicator. Green is you're still folding. Orange is it's partially folding, so there's something not completely right. And red is it's not folding back. Really useful if you're trying to learn the concept of query folding. And if you're interested in this, I highly recommend you look into the concept of query folding, because it is some cool, very, very cool stuff. But then, some of the complaints that I've seen end users give is that Power Query is not that visual tool like we had, for instance, Alteryx, which is a very powerful visual tool that allows users to do everything with a few clicks of the button and not having to write a single line of code. So that is not all going to change with what we're doing now, but we have introduced this interesting new thing called a diagram. And if we switch to the diagram view, this is where things start to get a bit more easy, because this is going to give us the logical flow of the data, where we're starting, what transformations we're doing, because we can extend this and look for the transformations that are happening, and then get that visual overview of what we're doing with the data. And me, personally, when I was making more complex stuff in Power Query, this is something that I would have wanted to have inside of the Power BI Desktop version. I'm not completely sure on when this is coming to desktop as well, but I have been assured that it's going to be there. And I am rooting for sooner rather than later, because this, again, is really useful if you're trying to understand these concepts of how Power Query works, of what you're doing inside of Power Query. Good. But the thing is, what I need to say to you is that this is a bit different as well. Because if we're hitting the Save button inside of Power BI, inside of Power BI Dataflows, this is not going to create a model for us. This is not going to create that virtual analysis services instance. No, this is going to write that data somewhere else. And what that somewhere else is what I'd like to show you now. Completely forgot about that, okay. So this thing called the common data model is what is important for this, because a common data model is a data lake under the covers. So yes, we are using that fancy buzzword called a data lake. We're hip, we're trendy, we're doing it. That's good. And it is essentially a unified metadata layer for cloud apps and services. A very marketing type of term, I know. And it does offer a shared set of a data language, a storage format and a location, and then a set of default entities. And this entire concept originated within the Dataverse, the Dynamics, the business applications landscape. They had this thing called Common Data Service as well, where they created a set of just default things, default entities, and then map everything to that single format. And that same format, that same method is being used under the covers here as well. Slightly different, but it's the same origin of things. And those entities that we had inside of the Dataverse landscape, inside of the business applications landscape, we can also use them here, but we can extend upon them. We can create our own entities if we want. We can extend with new information. And to give you an idea of what this is, the common data model, is lots of text on a small piece of canvas, but it is everything related to accounts, to customers, to what we have for products, about opportunities, so everything in the CRM, the ERP landscape. That is what the basis of this thing is. But in reality, this is all something called a common data model and a data lake. And the thing is that it is storing CSV file, comma-separated values, in a data lake for us. Everything we're doing inside of Power Query Online gets calculated, it gets processed, and then it's going to store that data down for us. So it's going to manage it for us. It's going to do everything we have to do. We don't have to think about a single thing, because Power BI is going to use that logic and make sure it all happens for us. And like I said, it is essentially a base of CSV files, which brings me to one of the limitations as well. It is CSV files. So it is not a recommended approach to go load that terabytes of data into a data flow, because it's going to be slow. It is going to be slow that way. It is CSV files, so keep that in mind. Everything that we have inside of that common data model gets written to something called the model.json file. And the model.json file, that is pretty much the shared language that I explained. It's going to describe everything for us in a JSON format that is easily understandable for everything using this common data model. And if you want to make it a bit bigger, if you want to think about big picture, it's that common data model that gets reused across Dynamics, across Dynamics 365, Dynamics 365 for F&O, Power BI, etc. So it's that same set of language that could potentially lead up to very interesting integration opportunities. But I'll quickly show you what it actually means, what this common data model is. So if I go back into my workspace, to my Dataflows Premium per User workspace, and then go to my data flow, what I can do here is I say, I want to export that JSON file. As soon as I do that, it's going to download a text file, a JSON file, and I can use that to import the model somewhere else. Or I can use that to put it somewhere into a source control system, whatever. I can do that thing. The only issue is it's giving you this weirdly formatted thing where everything is essentially on one single line. So I've done the cooking show method, downloaded a file for you as well, made sure it was formatted so we can easily show this in the first time. And it is, as I mentioned, a JSON file describing everything we've got in there. Queries, the metadata, what columns we have, what data types they have, which transformations we're doing in Power Query. It's all written in this JSON file. And it's not even that big. It's a few kilobytes of data. And that JSON file can easily be transported over to something else as well. Because for instance, if I were to go back to, and I say that I want to create a new data flow, this brings me up some options. If we're a bit patient for the internet. If I say that I want to import my model, this is where that JSON file comes back. I could go to another workspace. I could do this with APIs or the deployment pipelines in Power BI. As soon as I go and say I want to import that model, and I import that JSON file, it's going to create that data flow for me. It's just going to take everything I've got and put it into a new data folder for me. There we go. So when I open this up, it is essentially the same thing we had. And that is all because it's just that same format, that same JSON folder that we had before. And there are lots of more similarities that exist as well. Because how do we keep our data up to date? Well, it is an artifact in Power BI. We can manage it, and we can do this the exact same way as we do it with data sets. We can manually go up into the user face, right-click on the three ellipses, and say, refresh, please. Then it's going to trigger that refresh for us. We can schedule our refreshes as well, the same way we schedule the refreshes for Power BI data sets. The thing is, what I still think is a bit tricky with Power BI Dataflows is that if it starts to fail, it is not always as easy to start digging into that, to start troubleshooting that. Because the only way that we can get the detailed information out is if we download the error log information from the refresh history. So you have to take a few steps to go dig into why it is failing for us. It's hindersome, I know, but I'll take it. I'll take it. And the beauty of this is that in the scenario where we're linking other data flows to a data flow that we've created, I will get back to that, it's automatically going to refresh those related data flows, upstream and downstream if we desire to. So if we're creating a more complex scenario where we've got staging data flows, where we're doing transformations, where we're ending up in a star schema-like data flow, we can automatically refresh all those data flows when they're linked together, if that's the behavior we want to have. And sadly, incremental refresh, so refreshing only data since a certain point in time, is a premium feature, which means that if you're using Pro, you will not be able to use incremental refresh. Premium means premium capacity or premium per user. If you want to go and look at that reusability, because that's the word I've been shouting multiple times already, reusability. What are the options? And there's a big difference here between a Pro license and premium. Because all the cool things for reusability are premium. Sorry, that's the way it is. If we want to do that reusability, we're a bit stuck with what we have right now. For instance, if we have an existing format inside of Power BI Desktop, there's no easy migration path to a data flow. There are community scripts that extract that information for you and upload it to a data flow. Those things exist, but there's no UI-based behavior for you. Luckily, what you can do is copy-paste those queries. If you copy a query, right-click, copy the query inside of Power BI Desktop, you can paste that in data flows as well. The other way around sometimes works, but not always. It's not a completely foolproof scenario. But if we want to go and reuse those queries, we've got three options: reference, append, or merge. And then duplicate as well. Sorry, we've got 4 options. The most important thing for this is that that query cannot be enabled for load. And what does that mean is that the logic is going to exist, but that data is not going to be loaded into the final stage. That data is going to be loaded into the final stage of the data lake, but it's not going to be refreshed every single time, which is something you need to be aware of. If we reference the query, we create a logical link, but it's also going to duplicate that data for us, which means that if you do that a couple of times, you're going to end up with duplication of data, and it may not necessarily be the behavior that you want to have. And it is something you really need to be aware of. Not saying that it's a bad thing all of the times, but if you go do that 20 times with a fairly large table, that is not necessarily the behavior that you may want to have. Now, when we get to the premium stuff, premium per user, we've got this thing called linked or computed entities. And that is a process where we're going to do something called in-lake compute. All those transformations, they're going to be made inside of the data lake. Well, inside of the environment of the data lake. So that in-lake compute is going to handle for us the more complexity we have. That means that we can reference any single entity in any workspace that we have, if that workspace is premium or premium per user capacity. Then we can reference every single workspace. And that can lead to scenarios where we create different workspaces, a staging workspace, a curation workspace. Whatever type of scenario you've got in mind, this is where you can go into those more complex things. But you can also do that inside of the same workflow, inside of the same workspace, with different data flows. Whatever scenario, whatever topic you'd like to use, can be used for this one as well. The beauty of this one is that the data, the actual data, is only going to be stored in the original entity. So we only have one physical copy of the data. If we're looking at a fairly large table, this is interesting, because it's just going to point towards what we have. When we have that linked entity or the computed entity, we can still make other transformations. And this is a really useful tool for us. The one thing I do have to say, because I forgot to put that in the slide again, is this thing that enables the inlay compute is this fancy buzzword called the enhanced compute engine. And that enhanced compute engine is what really needs the premium capacity, because it's going to create sort of a SQL server for us that's going to query the data inside of the lake and return it to us, which is a really interesting a really interesting fact. So how do we go ahead and start reusing those demos? Well, that is an excellent question. Yep. Yep. Does this take up more space in the CSV format than when it's a data set? Excellent question. The answer is yes. We still have that data in the raw format of a data set, which means that it's not going to be compressed and not going to be optimized. The optimization is only going to start taking place when we load that into a data set, and then the data is going to be compressed. So yes, that means that your data is going to be in a larger data size when you're initially loading it. Thank you. Okay. So the thing is, I have my queries that I've created beforehand. And what you can see is that I've got these two queries that are marked cursive. This means that these queries are actually disabled for load, and that I'm using that reference behavior for that. So it's a date table and a station table where I'm using physical role-playing dimensions for this particular example. What it means is that if I go and look at my station, for instance, it's essentially a reference to that station table. It's going to create the reference and then work from there. I can start building my own transformations on this. I can start working with it. I could also duplicate. The thing is the difference between duplication and referencing is that you just copy over the entire entity, and if you make a change to the original entity, that change is not going to be taken over to the copied entity, which can lead to some form of technical debt and to that modular approach we're not enforcing. So if we talk about the pro behavior, my advice is go for referencing rather than duplication. But what changes if I say, for instance, that I do want to have the station table enabled for load? Well, as soon as I do these, we're seeing these little lightning icons pop up. And this is where it gets into that behavior for the in-lake compute, the enhanced compute engine. If I save this on a data set, on a workspace that is not backed by premium capacity, this is not going to work. I can save the query, but it's only going to tell me after I've saved the query, after I've validated it, that it's not going to work because of the fact that it doesn't allow that inlay compute to be used if I'm only using pro subscriptions for this, which can be bothersome. So in a pro solution, in a Power BI Pro subscription solution, I have to make sure that these things are not enabled for load and that I reference them. If I want to reference them again, I can right-click, I can say reference. It's going to create me a new entity, and I can go from there. The behavior of those linked entities is one of two things. We can do that inside of a single data flow, or I can go into another data flow and start reusing that as well. So let's say that I want to create a new data flow, and I want to create those linked tables. I can go ahead and say link tables from other data flows, and then it's going to look for any data flow that I have access to that is located in premium workspaces or in premium per user workspaces. And then as soon as the internet decides to come along, there we go. Getting there. There we go. This is going to give me the data flows that I've got available. And if I go into my premium per user data flow, I have these data flows that are originally created. And then I can go selecting which of these that I'd like to use. For instance, the end date and the start date. If I go ahead and go into transform data, this is going to create those references for me. And it's going to give you that little link icon that says you're using a linked entity, a computed entity. The data is only going to be stored in the original data flow, and we can start using it from here to make other transformations. That's where it gets interesting. But let's keep going. Because one of the questions I get a lot is, how do we deal with gateways for data flows? And the answer is, it's essentially the same way as we deal with gateways for Power BI Desktop. If it's a cloud data source, something in the cloud, SharePoint Online, whatever, we usually don't need that gateway. We don't need to have something shipping the data back to on-premises and then back to the cloud for us. It can just make that connection from a cloud to a cloud environment. If it's a source that resides in our on-premises environment, a SQL Server, Oracle, Teradata, it's going to leverage that exact same data gateway that we've got set up. And it means that if you want to create a data flow, you have to have the permissions to publish against that data source. You have to have those permissions on the gateway, which is similar as in Power BI datasets. If you want to publish that, you need to have those permissions on the gateway. Security is a topic where I'm not 100% satisfied with myself. I'll be very open about that. Because the security on a data flow itself is limited. That's really the thing. It is very, very limited. How are we doing for time? 16. OK, thank you. So data flows reside in a workspace. That means that the exact same way that we give people access to a workspace by permissions of admin, contributor, member, or viewer is going to determine if they can use those data flows as well. Creating the data flows, editing the data flows, or consuming the data flows. If they don't have access, they're not going to be able to use it. There is no, thank you, there is no solution, there is no scenario to selectively showing which of the entities can be shown to a consuming data flow user. Either you get the entire thing or you get nothing. The only option is to hide entities. And for those that have a bit more security background than me, security by obfuscation is not security. Please. If it's hidden, we can still access that. If you're a bit creative, you can get access to that data. So there is no form of selectively choosing which entities get exposed. It's everything or it's nothing. There is also no such thing as row-level security inside of a data flow. It's a very popular request, and I'm convinced that it will get there someday, but I've got no timeline. I don't have a timeline. And then when we look at when data flows are used, in most scenarios, that data from the data flow is going to be imported into a data set, and that means that security needs to be created in the data set, and that the data set publisher, the owner, is the one responsible for the data security, for row-level security, object-level security, for those things. It's their responsibility. And not every business user is as well-versed in those mechanisms. So when you're talking about potentially sensitive data or compliancy data, you may want to have a chat with them as well to see if they're doing things right from the first time. So why do I keep rambling on about these data flows? Well, I keep going back to the fact that it is for those business users, for those people that don't necessarily want to build data flows inside of an Azure Data Factory, or they don't want to build pipelines. They don't want to write Spark code. They just want to have a user interface. And there may be an issue on IT involvement. IT doesn't have the resources to help people. That may be a thing, and they'll just go ahead and do it themselves. Now, would you prefer them doing it inside of data flows, which gives you some form of reusability, or an Excel file that exists somewhere in the 17th level of a My Documents folder? Because people start finding creative ways, start finding creative routes to do their work. And if they don't get things done the way they needed to, they're going to find something else. They're going to go to the Excels, the Accesses. They're going to go to those manual processes to get the data they need. Maybe they'll even go look at other third-party tools, like an Alteryx, for instance, or like Tableau Prep. Maybe they'll just go towards that. They'll buy a license for that, and they'll start doing it. The data flows are for those Power Query users, those tech users that can help them build those easily reusable data entities if they take the basic design elements into mind when they're starting to design things. It offers you a really useful way of orchestrating and composing that data flow mechanism, because of the fact that if we're creating those linked entities, we can easily create an entire flow, an entire ETL flow, if you will, with a visual tool. We can have those multiple environments, those multiple stages, having a collaborative environment, starting to get that data somewhere we need to have. And it is self-service based in mind. That's it. It's self-service based. When I said that data flows is data lake, it also allows us to go do something else with it. Because the data lake that I mentioned is managed by Power BI. You cannot access it with anything else than Power BI, which is not always a useful thing. But if we bring something called Bring Your Own Data Lake Storage, which is attach your own resource group to this, we can land the data from data flows into our own data lake, into our own resource group container, in the format that Power BI dictates, but then we have that data. And this is where the IT geeks like myself get really giddy about it. Because in the past, what I've done with this is I've created something called Master Data Services sans Silverlight, the Master Data Services without the Silverlight. Master Data Services doesn't necessarily ring a bell to many of you, And I am envious for you that you are not aware of the massive pain in the buttocks that is. It was not a great tool, but it offered a really useful way of managing Excel files, because business users love Excel files. It's their thing. They love it. And when you need to start taking those Excel files to incorporate into your bigger data warehouse picture, that's where it can get a bit tricky. So the thing is, if you shift that responsibility and say, you are going to land that Excel file into the managed environment that we have, with, for instance, the external data lake storage. They do the transformations, they load up the data, and we pick it up and start working with this in the data lakes, in Synapse, in Databricks, whatever we're using. That's where it gets really interesting. Or when it's inside of the data lake, you can start copying that data yourself, you can start reusing that there and do whatever you'd like to do with it. It opens up the extensibility scenarios for that. So if you want to start using that, there are two things you need to have. The tenant setting needs to be enabled, because there is a tenant setting that allows your entire tenant to use this format. If that's okay, you're good to go. Then the second thing is, you need to have permissions for an Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 resource group and a container. If you have those things, you can go into a workspace, connect to the Azure environment, and then make sure that you can connect the appropriate resource group for that. As soon as you do that, the data needs to be refreshed, and it's going to land in that external container. My advice is, if you plan on using this, do this as early on as possible. Go through the pain of having those discussions with your IT environment of setting this up. Why am I saying this? Because the second you want to switch over between the two, all data needs to be reloaded. It's not going to automatically flip over everything. It's going to throw away all the data in the managed environment, and you need to reload everything into your own environment. So please take that in mind. What is the other beautiful thing about this is Power BI has this storage limit of 100 terabytes. And let's face it, none of us is going to hit that storage limit. If you use an external container, whatever you can pay for is whatever you can store. You're not bound by that storage limit. That's another example. And I've had customers go up to that limit. I've had them. And it is, if they store it in their own container, in their own external storage, that solves that problem as well. The other way around is we're taking that data from Power BI and we're landing it externally. We can flip that as well, where we prep that data coming from an external tool like Data Factory, Synapse, etc., where we prep that data, and if we can get it in the appropriate format, we can send that to Power BI as well, with something called an external CDM folder. And it's essentially the open standard. If it writes that manifest file, that JSON file, in the appropriate format, we can use it. So as soon as we've got that file, as soon as we can land it in the appropriate storage and the manifest format, we can link it to Power BI. Fair warning, there aren't that many tools that can create that exact manifest file. We still run into issues with this. It's not a foolproof solution. If you want to leverage your own data lake, my advice is go through tools like Synapse Serverless, go through tools like Databricks or those kind of things. It's going to be less painful than trying to get this to work 100% exactly for you. But for those small, simple scenarios, it actually does a fairly good job. So I've been talking a lot about data flows, but it's not all roses and sunshine. There are limitations. I'll be very open about that. It's not the complete foolproof scenario yet. Because what I've told is that the very cool stuff is premium. In incremental refresh, in-lake compute, AI features, that is all premium. And that is not, I know that not every organization has premium. But if you have it, it can be really useful for you. The other thing is that when you're creating those data flows and when you're stuffing a lot of complex logic, into a single file, into a single query, if you're trying to save that and validate that, it can take a very long time. The query validation is a pain point. It can take you up to 5–10 minutes if you're working with those complex queries to save whatever you're doing. And that's not always useful. If you modify your schema, if you change column names, if you change data types, all data will be dropped. Be aware. It's going to drop all the data. You have to reload. So if you're saying, oh, cool, well, I'll just change this data type, you can change it easily, but then everything has to be reloaded again, which is something you have to keep in mind, because it can kick you in the butt. Modification of those data flows is something that can only be done by the owner. And an owner can only be one person, which means that if you're working in a team, and that team has to multiply, all have to have those privileges, you have to switch around ownership or work with a generic account. There is no really good collaboration story on a single data flow. The only thing you can do is create multiple data flows in modular approaches and then bring them all together in one master data flow. That's how you can tackle this. The other thing is, if you're working with a data flow and you're using multiple data sources, SQL Server, another Oracle, for instance, the same SQL Server but with different credentials, that is not supported right now. You cannot use multiple credentials in a single data flow, which is a pain point, I know. And then if you're going for the continuous integration, continuous deployment, or the application lifecycle management, it's not a smooth story. It means that whenever you're building your flow, whenever you're building your flow and you're passing it through the different stages, it's going to drop and recreate it. It creates a new ID, and if you want to use that ID in your processes, it's going to break some things. So the ALM story is not completely smooth. And it will not also fix existing references to other entities, which means that it can break some stuff where you have to go and fix it yourself again, which can be bothersome. And then this one last thing is something my colleague from the CAT team, Matthew Roach, created, is essentially an easy overview of what this actually is. And like I mentioned, it is self-service data preparation in a Power Query Online environment, loading your data into Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 for business users who want to have that Excel-esque look and feel and the Excel-esque replacements. What it isn't is it's not a data set. You still have to load your data in a data set. It's not a full-fledged data warehouse. It's also not those IT pro tools like integration service or data factory, etc. You can use it with pro, subscriptions only, but the cool stuff is premium only. So if I have to go into takeaways, for me personally, it's for those business-driven initiatives. Business people that want to make something out of their data. And they don't want to necessarily wait until IT's got time in their sprint schedules. Or it can be to fill existing gaps. If you have that data warehouse environment, but you know that that new dimension or that new fact table is not going to arrive for 6 sprints down the road, why not prototype it and plug a small hole? The key thing is you have to make sure that that data flow needs to have the grow-up story, the adulting story, to go into the corporate level as well. There needs to be some form of transfer of ownership where it gets incorporated into the bigger pictures as well. For that quick prototyping, for instance. And, like I said, in the end, it should mostly land up in some form of governed aspect. Is it completely enterprise? Is it self-service with some form of governance by IT? Everything can work. I mean, whatever works for you is okay, but we need to have some form of governance to not end up not end up in the Excel chaos that we've known and still exists. And for me personally, I usually go for the external storage. If I need it or not, I prefer to have it done so that I can use it if I need to have it. Back in April 2021, there was a very big blog post that lays out multiple points of what they're trying to fix. We're nearly up at April 2022, and most of these things have still got to land. So they're running into delays, but I am still very convinced that when these things get here, the Dataflow story is going to get a very big boost in its usability. There are lots of resources inside of the slide deck if you want to use them. The slide deck is already up there. Just to reiterate, if you want to reach out to me, find any of the social handles, or I'll be spending most of the afternoon at the Microsoft booth, so you can find me there as well. Usually, I'm not that hard to spot in the crowd. You'll find me. Which all leads me to say thank you for being here, thank you for your time, and if you please want to fill in the feedback form for me, that is extremely useful. It gives me the opportunity to improve my presentation, and it's really useful to see what you think of this. If you have questions, feel free to ask them. If you don't have any questions, I wish you a lovely rest of the day. Thank you. Yep.
So one person has said that you said about the access for the data lake and asking if you can use Azure Data Studio to access data lakes as well.
Can you repeat it, please?
Can you access the data lake using Azure Data Studio?
Can you access the data lake using Azure Data Studio? You can only access that data lake if you're using the external storage. If you're using the default mode for Power BI, it is completely locked in. We cannot access it, period. There's no way of getting to that. It's way deep into the storage layers, into the encryptions of Power BI.
Okay, and another question. Certain transformations or changes or updates in data sources causes the data flow to go and load the data from scratch. Are there any ways around it or any best practices?
Can you repeat it? The plane flew over, yeah.
Okay. Certain transformations or changes or updates in the data source causes the data flow to go and load data from scratch. Is there a way around it or anything you can do to avoid it?
Okay, so certain transformations or certain actions happening in a data source will trigger a reload in a data flow itself. Are there any actions around this? I don't have an answer for that. Sorry. Yeah. Any more questions? Yep, in the back. Yeah, okay. So if we load data from our Power BI Dataflow into Power BI Desktop, is it automatically going to pick up relations, or do we have to create them ourselves? You have to recreate them yourself. If you have the matching field names inside of Power BI Desktop, if that option is set on, it's going to make suggestions. But I personally eliminated that setting because it leads to more issues usually than it does well for me. So usually you have to go recreate those relationships yourself. Any more questions? Yep, go ahead. I'm sorry. Yeah. Go ahead.
Gateways and the online sources. If you've got the gateways doing the prep for the data sets and stuff
Yeah.
for an on-prem source, is there an equivalent sort of like gateway mechanism that's being used for online service data sources?
Yeah. Okay.
Are you missing out the gateway prep process if you're using Azure data source?
Okay. So the question is, we've outlined the process for gateways for on-premises sources. if we're using online sources, can we start leveraging those same mechanisms as well for cloud-based data sources? The answer to that still needs to arrive into general availability, is something called a VNet gateway, where you're creating a virtual network in between those cloud services. And then you can start leveraging the gateway for cloud-to-cloud communication. VNets are not into GA yet. And if you want to talk about that, VNets, the PM for that was here this week, but I'm not sure if she is today. She's called Michela de Boer, and she can probably give you some information about that one as well. Or pop by the stand later, and we can talk about that. Okay, any more questions? Go ahead.
You mentioned that you have these different data flows. You have the one you have in Data Factory,
Yeah.
and it has all those limitations where you can't, there are some M operations and functions you can use. You don't have this in this one, right? Because it's not the Spark cluster that's underneath.
Yeah, okay. So the question is, I mentioned mapping data flows in Azure Data Factory as well. That has some limitations, but to what extent are they the same thing? No, sorry, yeah. The wrangling data flows, yeah, okay. Wrangling data flows. So wrangling data flows in mapping data flows, how does that relate to Power BI data flows? The engine is the same thing. It runs on the Power Query engine. The difference between the two is where it lands that data. Power BI is always going to land that data into the managed data lake storage folder or into the external data lake storage folder, where wrangling data flows gives you a bit more options to land it. The thing is that the UI in wrangling data flows lacks a bit, is a bit behind in the UI that we see inside of Power BI data flows, for instance. So there's a discrepancy on that. The thing is that the change that's been made into the organization of Microsoft is that we used to have a Power Query team for Power BI, a Power Query team for Power Platform, and then some other Power Query team somewhere else. It is now a global Power Query team, which means that the direction it's moving to is that all those experiences are going to be as identical as possible with a more generic approach to how things are handled. So you'll see some convergence, but where they're landing the data is not going to change any time in the future. It's just about feature parity. It's just about how the thing looks as well.
But you don't have all the limitations, right?
No, you don't have the same limitations, no. Okay. Any more questions? Which just leaves me, enjoy the rest of your day and have fun. Thank you for coming.